Well, that painting, today's painting is Priscilla and Aquila from an unknown artist from the 1600s. You see there, I like it because it shows them doing their leather work and woodwork, their tent making, and so they're there, and then we'll find out that that's what they do, and that's what Paul does. So it seemed like a nice one. I have a few more illustrations in here just to warn everybody. I tried something. I always like to be trying new things, so I tried to have this artificial intelligence generate these images. So these are not generated by humans. They're generated by by a computer. And I think it did a pretty good job. So tell me what you think of them. But it's I told it to make an image of something related to the slide that it goes on, and Microsoft lets you do that now. It's amazing what you can do today. Well, anyway, I'm going to then get us started today and remind us or refresh those who weren't able to be here last week that Luke, the author of this book of Acts, recounted Paul's journey last week to Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens. And what we found was that despite opposition from the Jews, Paul fearlessly preached about Jesus as the Messiah. They kicked him out of Thessalonica eventually, so he went to Berea and found a much more receptive audience there who wanted to go study the word and learn. And they didn't just take Paul's word at face value. They said, what does it say in the Bible? And does that go align with what you're saying, Paul? And they found that it did. So then they became believers. And so then then Paul had to leave Berea because those pesky Thessalonians came down there and to Berea and chased him out. So he went down to Athens and preached to the philosophers in Athens, told them about God, and he did, like I say, face opposition, but he fearlessly preached it. In Athens, he engaged in this intellectual debates with the philosophers, and he actually convinced a few of those philosophers, despite their desire just to be really not wanting to tie themselves down to any one religion or idea. They like to, just kind of, I guess you could say their idol was learning about new religions and new ideas. That's what they idolize more than just picking one, the true one, and going with it. Well, this week we're going to witness Paul's unwavering resilience. The theme this week is on Paul's resilience as he travels to Corinth. Here he's going to meet Priscilla and Aquila, while, like I just showed you them, while working as tent maker, and he continues to preach at the synagogue. But facing Jewish opposition there, he shifts his focus once again to the Gentiles. Then he starts his journey home to Antioch in Syria. That's his home base, where he started this second journey. And while continuing, while on the road there, he continued to encourage and strengthen the disciples in the various cities he encountered on the way. Well, Charles Spurgeon once said, by perseverance, the snail reached the ark. With its 200,000 people, Corinth was not an easy place to start a church, yet that's where Paul went after leaving Athens. And he went alone. The going was tough, but he did not give up. Corinth had this reputation for wickedness, and which was known for all over the Roman empires. Like Corinth was the Las Vegas of their day. Thanks to its location, the city was a center for both trade and for travel. It was a crossroads in a big city there. Money, vice, strange philosophies, new religions. They came to Corinth and found their home. Corinth was the capital of this region of Achaia, and one of the two most important cities Paul visited, the other being Ephesus. Well, God opens doors, and when he does it, the enemy always tries to close them. And sometimes we may even close them ourselves when we get discouraged. However, as we see in Paul's ministry in Corinth, the Lord gave him the encouragement he needed to persevere. This same source of inspiration and support is available to us today. And it reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles. God's always there. We can overcome any obstacle with faith and dedication. Let's look at Paul's devoted helpers first. Acts 18, 1 through 5.
Then Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he became acquainted with a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently arrived from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They had left Italy when Claudius Caesar deported all Jews from Rome. Paul lived and worked with them, for they were tent makers, just as he was. Each Sabbath found Paul at the synagogue, trying to convince the Jews and Greeks alike. And after Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul spent all his time preaching the word. He testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah.
So Paul, like I said, went to Corinth after preaching to these Greek philosophers. And in Corinth, he focused on Jesus Christ, the cross, the Holy Spirit, and the simple gospel. Corinth, okay, so we're going to look at some of 1 Corinthians appropriately, since we're in Corinth now. The second chapter, verses 1 through 5, I'll read it. When I first came to you, dear brothers and sisters, I didn't use lofty words and impressive wisdom to tell you God's secret plan, for I decided that while I was with you, I would forget everything except Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified. I came to you in weakness, timid and trembling, and my message and my preaching were very plain. Rather than use clever, persuasive speeches, I relied on the power of the Holy Spirit. I did this so you would be trusting not in human wisdom, but in the power of God. See, Paul tuned his message to meet the audience in Athens. He did use those clever words and persuasive language. Here, he's just wants to say, here's the gospel, and let's let God do the work.
I don't know how to mute it.
Do you want me to mute it for you?
Yeah, that would be good.
Okay. Corinth had many philosophers and false teachers who exploited the people, kind of like in Athens, but they were a little meaner. They would go, and these false teachers intentionally wanted to exploit the people. So Paul had to distinguish himself from being one of them. Now this is a more evil city than Athens was. So they would be naturally distrustful of Paul because they're used to these deceivers coming in and fooling them and misleading them. Well, how did he do that? How did he distinguish them? He did this by being humble. He took the right approach. He did this by making tents with Aquila and Priscilla, who were these leather workers, just like Paul, or tent makers. Jewish rabbis worked in a trade and did not take money from their students. So Paul learned to make these tents as a boy and used that skill to support himself in his ministry. We see that through in Acts and in several places in 1 Corinthians about how he's a tent maker at that time. We don't know if Aquila and Priscilla were already Christians but they probably were. In fact, they may have even been the founding members of the church in Rome. We do know that they served faithfully and risked their lives for Paul, and they helped him in Ephesus, where they hosted a church in their home. So they eventually went to Ephesus and they helped him there. Aquila and Priscilla were part of Paul's team from this point forward, and he thanked God for them. They show how lay ministers can help the work of the Lord. Today, each pastor thanks God for people like Aquila and Priscilla, who use their hands, their hearts, and their homes for the work of God. Well, Paul stayed and worked with Aquila and Priscilla, but also preached boldly in the synagogue on Sabbath days. That was his main purpose in Corinth, right, to preach. When Silas and Timothy then came, as Ida read, from Macedonia, they brought money from these Macedonians, which let Paul then freed him up to preach full time. Paul was happy to see his friends, certainly, and it was just good news to hear that the Christians in the churches they had ministered had started together, so much so they sent him money. Paul was a great Christian in ministry, a missionary, but he couldn't do it alone. It took friends like Priscilla and Aquila, Silas and Timothy, and these Macedonians to help Paul serve the Lord well. His old, new friends encouraged him when he needed it the most. So the message for us is we can also encourage our friends in the Lord's work. Paul said, carry each other's burden and so fulfill the law of Christ in Galatians 6, verse 2. Well, next thing though, believe it or not, in this evil, corrupt city, he found an opposition, and that's in Acts 18, 6 through 8.
But when they opposed and insulted him, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, your blood is upon your heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go preach to the Gentiles. Then he left and went to the home of Titus Justus, a Gentile who worshiped God and lived next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, and everyone in his household believed in the Lord. Many others in Corinth also heard Paul, became believers, and were baptized.
Well, when God blesses a ministry, expect increased opposition, but also expect opportunities. 1 Corinthians 16:9 says, for a great and effective door has opened to me, and there are many adversaries. So there's Paul's attitude. This door is open to me. That's the opportunity. And there are many adversaries. The enemy gets angry. The devil gets angry when we invade his territory and free his captives. In Thessalonica and Berea, these unbelieving Jews who rejected the word stirred up trouble for Paul and his friends, and they followed him around. Such opposition usually proves that God is at work, which should encourage us. Charles Spurgeon used to say, the devil never kicks a dead horse. Just so he goes after the ones that are causing him trouble. Jewish opposition at first forced Paul to leave, as I mentioned, Thessalonica and Berea, but in Corinth, it didn't. It only made him more determined to stay and complete his mission. As verse 6 said, it talks about, in verse 6 there, it says, Paul shook the dust from his clothes and said, your blood is upon your own heads. He uses, I am innocent. From now on, I'll go preach to the Gentiles. Anyway, that uses two Old Testament images, and those people would know it too. First, to shake one's garment was an act of judgment, saying, you've had your opportunity, but now it's over. And today we might say the equivalent would be like washing our hands of a situation. Okay, I tried. Okay, you're up to your own things now. Well, while Paul never stopped witnessing to the Jews, his primary calling was, as God edicted, to evangelize the Gentiles. To have blood on your hands means bearing the responsibility for another's death because you didn't warn them. The image comes from a watchman on the city walls who must alert the people of coming danger. But to have blood on your head means that you are to blame for your own judgment because you rejected salvation. Ezekiel 3 verses 17 through 21 are a good example of that. Son of man, I have appointed you as a watchman for Israel. Whenever you receive a message from me, warn people immediately. If you warn the wicked, saying, you are under penalty of death, but you fail to deliver the warning, if I warn the wicked through you, saying you are under penalty of death, but you fail to deliver that warning to them, they will die in their sins, and I will hold you responsible for their deaths. But if you warn them and they refuse to repent and keep on sinning, they will die in their sins. But you will have saved yourself because you obeyed me. So that's the idea. Paul's hands were clean because he faithfully declared the gospel. The Jews had their own blood on their own heads for rejecting the truth. At just the right time, God brought Gentile, God-fearing Titus Justus into Paul's life. Some believe his full name was Gaius Titus Justus, referred to as Gaius, my host, when Paul wrote Romans 6:23. The connection between Gaius and Crispus, the synagogue leader, in verses 7 through 8 that Ida read, and again in 1 Corinthians 1:14 is significant because that connection, you'll see how it's significant in a minute, because eventually the synagogue leader was converted, probably through Crispus as much as Paul. Anyway, Paul left the synagogue then and began preaching at Titus Justus' house next door to the synagogue. So he was pretty much the same place. This was a wise decision. It allowed him to maintain contact with everybody he was preaching with, the Jews and the Gentile proselytes, plus now Gentiles. As a result, Paul even converted, like I said, the chief ruler of that synagogue, and his entire family turned to the Lord. This must have stirred the Jewish population in Corinth. Oh boy, now you've hit the hornet's nest. Paul's associates baptized most new converts, just as Jesus' disciples did. But the important thing is that the believer's obedience, not the name of the minister who does the baptizing. But even if it wasn't Paul, it doesn't matter. It's God behind the whole thing. Walking by faith means seeing opportunities even in the midst of opposition, like Paul did. You know, pessimists would see only problems. Pessimists would say, "Oh, they kicked me out. I'll go. I won't. I'll stop." You know, but a realist, an optimist sees only potential, and ignores that he just keep going to the temple till he got arrested, maybe. But the realist sees the potential in the problems. So Paul didn't ignore the dangers and the difficulties while he was there in Corinth, but he viewed them as from a divine perspective. Faith means obeying God's will despite your feelings or the circumstances or the consequences of what would happen if you obeyed God's will. There has never been an easy place to serve God. If there is, something might be wrong. Paul reminded Timothy, yes, and all who desire to live godly in Jesus Christ will suffer persecution. And so when we suffer persecution, whether it's sickness or whatever, or someone just doing things to us because we're Christians, see it as opportunity rather than as, be the optimist, be the realist, and figure out what you can do about it. Well, one thing that helped Paul go on despite all of that persecution were words of assurance he received. Let's move then to Acts 18, verses 9 through 17.
One day the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision and told him, "Don't be afraid. Speak out. Don't be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack and harm you, for many people in the city belong to me." So Paul stayed there for the next year and a half, teaching the word of God. But when Gallio became governor of Achaia, some Jews rose up together against Paul and brought him before the governor of judgment. They accused Paul of persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to our law. But just as Paul started to make his defense, Gallio turned to Paul's accusers and said, "Listen, you Jews, if this were a case involving some wrongdoing or a serious crime, I would have a reason to accept your case. But since it is merely a question of words and names and your Jewish law, take care of it yourselves. I refuse to judge such matters." And he threw them out of the courtroom. The crowd then grabbed Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and beat him right there in the courtroom. But Gallio paid no attention.
So you're almost starting to like Gallio, and then he lets him beat this poor guy. Anyway, let's look at what Ida read there. The conversion of Crispus, key Jewish leader, opened more evangelistic opportunities and increased opposition. The Jewish community in Corinth was furious at Paul's success and sought to silence him. Luke hinted at that the situation had become particularly dangerous, prompting Paul to consider leaving. However, the Lord assured Paul to stay, saying, "Fear not," which calmed his heart. The Lord's assurance was like his reassurances to countless people before in the history of the Bible: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jehoshaphat, Daniel, Mary, and Peter. Jesus had appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus, in the temple, during his imprisonment in Jerusalem and Rome. God's angel also encouraged Paul during that storm at sea, demonstrating God's constant presence with him. Jesus assured Paul that no one would harm him and that many people would be saved. This assurance reflects in the doctrine of divine election. The doctrine of divine election, emphasizing that the Lord knows those who were his. Look at what Paul wrote in 2 Timothy 2:19, late in his life. But God's truth stands firm like a foundation of stone with this inscription: "The Lord knows those who were his, and all who belong to the Lord must turn away from evil." A divine election should encourage evangelism. You might think, well, if it's all decided ahead again, why do I need to evangelize? No. And Paul preached with faith because you can know that God has chosen people for salvation. That's a good thing. We don't know who God's elect are, though. So we should preach to everyone so that we can be part of God's great plan to reach his chosen elect. And then what we do is trust God to save their souls. Accepting God's truth means acting on it, not speculating. Paul focused on winning souls, not debating the divine sovereignty and human responsibility or any of these high-level things. He just went after people's souls. We should ensure ourselves, our salvation, and then share the gospel with others. So we don't know who they are, so we better go find them, because that's what God wants us to be part of, that wonderful plan he's got. Well, Paul remained in Corinth for 18 months, witnessing many victories despite this opposition. He stayed there for a year and a half. The church consisted of sinners transformed by God's grace. Sinners transformed by God's grace, not mighty and noble people. Luke shares one example of divine protection during Paul's ministry in Corinth, when that thing with Gallio. And that's when the new proconsul arrived. The Jews hoped that Rome would declare Christianity illegal. They wanted to just, okay, this new guy's in town, maybe we can get him to say that Christianity is illegal. And they attacked Paul, but Gallio shut him down, recognized the issue was Jewish religious dispute. The Greeks then beat Sosthenes, the new synagogue leader, but Gallio ignored it. If Sosthenes later converted, it would show God's providence in turning opposition into opportunities for grace for him too. Well, in Acts, Luke highlights the Roman government's relationship with the Christian church a little bit here. While the Jewish council prohibited preaching of Paul, there's no evidence that Rome did this. Roman officials were tolerant and sometimes cooperative in places like Philippi, Corinth, and Ephesus. Paul wisely used his Roman citizenship to work with the government, avoiding while avoiding accusing the government or trying to escape its authority. Acts 25, let's skip ahead to Acts 25, 10 through 12. Let's see that. But Paul replied, "No, this is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well that I'm not guilty of harming the Jews. If I've done anything, if I have done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I am innocent, no one has the right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar." So Festus conferred with his advisors and replied, "Very well, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you will go." And so he, that's how he was able to get to Rome. Well, as a prisoner, but that's the way God planned it. The next transition here is to God's will. We see God's will done, and that's in Acts 18 through 8, verses 18 through 22.
Paul stayed in Corinth for some time. After that, then said goodbye to brothers and sisters and went to nearby Caesarea. There he shaved his head according to Jewish custom, making the end of a vow. Then he set sail for Syria, taking Priscilla and Aquila with him. They stopped first at the port of Ephesus, where Paul left the others behind. While he was there, he went to the synagogue to reason with the Jews. They asked him to stay longer, but he declined. As he left, however, he said, "I will come back later, God willing." Then he set sail from Ephesus. The next stop was at the port of Caesarea. From there, he went up and visited the church at Jerusalem, and then he went back to Antioch.
So Paul believed in doing God's will and he felt that was essential for his life and his ministry. Of course, right? God's will. He called himself an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God in many letters. He trusted God's will even when he was facing these difficulties. So after a year and a half of ministry, like I said, Paul felt that God wanted him to leave Corinth and return to his home in Antioch. His friends, Priscilla and Aquila, actually went with him to Ephesus and stayed there while he left for Caesarea. later in Acts 18:24, we're going to continue the church's story in Ephesus and the vital role of Aquila and Priscilla there. He meets Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth, and then they become his workers there in Ephesus later. Cenchrea was Corinth's seaport. Corinth was inland and Cenchrea was on the coast. There was a Christian church there. Paul shaved his head because he had made a vow. This probably means a Nazirite vow, as in Numbers 6. And of course, then Samson was born to be a Nazirite, so he didn't shave his hair. And it was voluntary. It was a way to show personal devotion to the Lord, not a way to earn salvation or holiness. He let his hair grow for a specific amount of time, then cut it when the vow ended. He also wouldn't have drunk any grapes or anything, wine or anything like that while he was doing the vow. We don't know why he made the vow. Maybe it was a special commitment to God during the tough times early in the ministry in Corinth, or maybe the vow was a way of thanking God for all his blessings. But according to Jewish law, the Nazirite vow had to end in Jerusalem with right sacrifices. One shaved his head at the end of the vow, not at the beginning, and he didn't have to be in Jerusalem to make the vow. Just to finish it. Luke doesn't say how long Paul was in Ephesus, but it's probably a pretty short time, because it's saying that he's journeying back to trying to get back to his home base there in closer to home, and so he wouldn't have stayed too long there that first time. The Jews there seemed more open to the gospel and asked Paul to stay, but he wanted to go to finish that vow. Okay, he wanted to get to Jerusalem to finish this Nazirite vow, and then to Antioch tell the church what happened. But he promised to return, God willing, and he did, which we'll see very soon. The words, "I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem," in Acts 18:21. 18:21. "I will come back later, God willing." Well, it's not in there, but if you click on this little, it says, "I must by all means be at Jerusalem for the upcoming festival, but I will come back later." That's the version we read left that out because it's not in all the manuscripts, but it's in a lot of them. So it's worth considering here. It doesn't mean that Paul and the early Christians had to observe Jewish feasts. Like that was like, you got to be a Jew and obey all the Jewish laws. No, he had a different reason for being there. It wasn't to obey the law, so the old law, so much as if he's there during the important feast times like Passover and so forth, it would give him a chance to meet and witness to influential Jewish leaders from all over the Roman Empire. So that was his chance to share the gospel more. He could also serve the Christian Jews who came back to their homeland that way. So he's anticipating for this feast, these Christian Jews coming back in. Paul taught clearly that keeping religious feasts was not a way to salvation or holiness. And we are free to follow our conscience if we do not judge others or make others stumble, is a big theme that Paul has later, like in Romans 14 and 15. Well, when he got to Caesarea, he went to Jerusalem. So Caesarea is the seaport that's pretty close to Jerusalem, not too far from where Tel Aviv is now in relationship to Jerusalem. He went to there and greeted the believers in Jerusalem, and then he made his farewell and went to Antioch and reported to his home church everything God did on his second missionary journey. That must have been exciting for him and for them, that all these things that happened. It'd be like several campfire discussions about, well, you should have been there in that jail when this happened, that kind of thing. He'd been away from Antioch for over 2 years, and they were all delighted to see him and hear about God's work among the Gentiles. We don't know for sure, but Paul probably kept telling the believers in Antioch, it's always too soon to quit. Yeah, because that's a good reminder for us to remember today. It's always too soon to quit, and that's the overriding theme of this whole chapter, in a way, just to see how, despite all of the struggles Paul met, he used them as opportunities to then go and share the gospel. And so let's think about that today when we hit setbacks, and whether it's in our brain, just feeling discouraged, or whether it's somebody actively telling you you can't talk about this at school, or something like that. Just keep that in mind. Well, to summarize today in this lesson, Paul traveled to Corinth. He met Aquila and Priscilla, who became good friends and devoted members to help him. And then he worked there as tent maker, continued to preach in the synagogue. Undeterred by the opposition, he shifted his focus to the Gentiles. His journey took him back to Antioch in Syria eventually, where he continued to encourage and then strengthen disciples there. And in the various cities, like we just said, saw Ephesus along the way. So next week, okay, where are we now? We just finished the second journey, Paul's second trip, and he's about to start his third missionary journey, where he's going to go and strengthen the disciples in Galatia and Phrygia, spend considerable time in Ephesus. He said he would, where he'll teach and perform miracles and face opposition from local craftsmen led by Demetrius, because they get a little worried that when he says that their gods aren't real and that they won't make very much money anymore making god idols. Anyway, this leads to a riot over the impact of Paul's ministry, on their business and their trade. So that'll be interesting as Paul goes through the next phases of his his attempt to reach the Gentiles and the Jews. That's going to be in chapter 6 of Be Daring. All right, Will, what are some thoughts that came to your mind as we were reading this? Some of your musings or feelings. Oh, hi, Larry. Good to see your face. Oh, I've muted you. Let me unmute you. Okay, now you should be able to talk.
There we go. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
I'm sorry you're not feeling well.
Oh, it'll pass. It'll pass. I'm quite a bit better than I was earlier.
That's good. Okay. Janet, do you have any thoughts?
Well, we had a big family get together yesterday because our grandson, who is a pastor in Westchester, had an event that he and his wife needed to attend. And so we had the great-grandchildren and the grandchildren. And of course, my daughter and her husband were here. And they did most of the heavy lifting. Larry and I just sat and watched the kids play. But my one daughter who was here was explaining to me, because my grandson went to a Pride Week event. And I said to my daughter Heather, I really struggle as a Christian. Not that we shouldn't love everybody. I know we're commanded to love, everybody, no matter what their orientation is. But I struggle with the idea of homosexuals being in leadership in the church. And my daughter explained what her son, the pastor, told her, which was that the parts of the Bible which talk about homosexuality in very negative terms was really discussing pedophilia. And it wasn't translated until the 60s by scholars as homosexuality. It was translated as pedophilia before that. And that the Bible is not as opposed to homosexuality as I always believed it was. And that we need to just love people where they are and bring them to Christ, and God will take care of any deficiencies or what we might consider deficiencies in their lives. And that's kind of what Paul was doing. He was just ministering to the people where they were and let God take care of the idea of who were his elect. And that helped me a great deal yesterday. I've been thinking about it ever since my daughter and I had the talk yesterday, that it's not up to me to decide who is doing what. That's God's. All I need to do is love people and accept people the way they are, and then God will take care of it. And that really was a freeing moment for me, because I thought up until that discussion yesterday, I just really struggled with that idea. And I feel better about it now. And then the lesson that we've been studying this week with Paul, loving people and leaving the decision of whether they are going to accept Christ or not up to them and God. And all we have to do is share the message. That made me feel a lot better.
Thanks for sharing that. I like the idea that it's not up to us to decide if God's going to eventually save someone. If the person is an alcoholic, you love them, you share the word with them. If they're a pedophiliac, then, or whatever that's called, you share the word with them and you love them. If they're a homosexual, you do the same. Now,
exactly.
the part I've got to go and be a Berean and study is the assertion by this one person that the Bible is talking only about pedophilia when it brings up homosexuality, because I've not heard that. I want to go study to see whether there's truth in that, or if that's someone's wishful thinking of an interpretation or what, because I've heard so many people recently say that it's not. So that warrants some study, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
It would be it's what we want to hear, because then it makes it easier to be in this world right now. And like you say, you don't have to struggle with that anymore. If it's really true that we've been deceived for 2,000 years till 1960, then so be it, and we'll learn. But that's something that does, I think, requires more than someone just telling me that. I want to see it, see where the
Great.
yeah. Well, thank you. That's very interesting, and it brings up this something in this lesson today, the fact that we do encounter these challenges today. The world is different. It's thinking from the way it was, and we can't go out and be, like you said, the optimist who assumes that everybody thinks like we do, or the pessimist that thinks everybody else is lost. We have to be the realist and go see some people's ideas are going to be acceptable in today's society, but they're not the right ideas. And some of them are going to be ideas that we think are wrong, but they are right. And then there are going to be some that don't matter, like how long your hair is cut, something like
Yeah.
that. So okay, you've given me a challenge. All of us, I hope, a challenge to go verify the veracity of that statement. Very good.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very interesting
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
to me.
Yes.
That's pretty deep for thought.
It
Mhm.
is. Yeah.
Oh, what we've been taught so all these years. And
Yes.
it does make one wonder,
It-
about any individual. We don't know their minds and their hearts,
Right.
but I think that we see as humans, action shows a lot in one's life. And so
Yes.
we,
Yeah.
all we can do is pray for that grace. I haven't had to face that yet, but we don't know what the future will bring. We just don't know.
Well, I've had to struggle with it in my family that one of my relatives, three children are now that way. And I'm particularly, but so that's definitely worth some study for me.
Yes.
Yes. I listened to radio at night and I heard a discussion on all of that about the genetics factor and the gene. And that all interests me just a whole lot because we know a lot in today's world, but we don't know everything
No.
at all.
Yep.
It's just a prayerful matter, that is for sure. Although
Yes.
I look at it, I would never oppose to anybody. I don't care who they are or what they do coming to church. I've always been wanted to be a little careful who's in a position of leadership for others.
Yes.
I'm a little picky about that because that's where everything comes from are your leaders.
Mhm.
So, little black and white, I'm afraid.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I appreciate you all so much. I'm gonna sign off.
Okay, Jeannie.
Okay, Jeannie.
Glad you could join us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, Jeannie.
Bye, Jeannie.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Okay.
Dean.
Bye.
All of you.
Bye-bye. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's something well, let's just see where that goes.
Yes.
I heard, during the D-Day celebrations, there was one veteran of World War II that said that he had all these values growing up and that led him to World War II, and he did the best he could with all that. And then the years that he's lived after that time, he can hardly recognize America anymore. And he was struggling all the time with how to fit in. This older man, was thinking about all those kind of things and all the challenges that he had. And I was thinking about all those veterans and all the older people in our society, how they have struggles too, just like the young people who are trying to find themselves. And, just to be sensitive of them and try to help them with whatever we say, help them to fit in and to understand, like you were saying, Janet.
Well, I think my I think my grandson and his wife are they're in Westchester, so they're ministering. Their church has a large elderly population, but also they're surrounded by universities there,
Mhm.
and so they are having an outreach ministry to younger people, and it's really, I think it's been a struggle for my grandson to reach the different people at different ages with the gospel, and his response is, I just love everybody.
Mhm.
And that is a good response. That's what you're supposed to do. You're not to judge, you're to love, and that's what he's trying to do. But it's a struggle for me. It really is a struggle for me.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what Paul faced in trying to preach to Jews and to Gentiles and all the different ideas that the Gentiles must have had, all
Right.
the paganism, but he seemed to, if he wasn't successful somewhere, he went and kept trying elsewhere.
Don't give up. That's
give up.
the message this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always too soon to quit.
Yes.
Always too soon to quit. Thanks, Larry. That's a good way to end this.
Sure
So
is.
I will go ahead and close the recording.